Hello, ladies and gentlemen, today is March the 10th, 2024, and we are here to talk about the world. Current events, foreign policy, economics, you name it. We are here to talk about it with you in the chat. So without any further delays, let's begin world discussion with Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello?
Yo.
Hey. How are you?
Well, good, except for a couple things. My heckin' Baldur's Gate honor run level 6 in Act 2 wiped today. I'm still kind of grieving it. 25 hours into that one. Into the abyss of deadness. So, you know what I have failed for that fight? Why I died? I didn't pre-clear the hallway. So whenever I fought the kind of boss lady in the area, she has the two wolves with her. Then the door opened, and an archer, and then like two other people came through. So
yeah, that was a tough fight. She kept disarming my Lazelle.
Yeah.
Lazelle. She didn't do anything.
Yep, she has a fear cast that she puts on people, which causes them to drop their weapon and run away.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see how that would be a bottleneck in an honor run.
Yep, but I hadn't gotten to that fight before in the honor run, so I'll be honest, I didn't respect it enough. Because like some of the fights, you have a legendary action boss and you kind of know, okay, this is a really tough one, so I need to be over-prepared. But for this one, I thought it was going to be a lot easier. I didn't account for the reinforcements. But I just walked past those reinforcements when I could have just attacked them earlier, which would have been nice. Thank you, Trisha.
So quick question. How far have you made? What's the furthest you've made it in the game thus far?
Love you, bye. That was in my tactician playthrough, so not an honor mode run. I'm in Act 3.
Okay.
Maybe a handful of hours in Act 3. Like 5 to 10 hours in.
Okay.
I had to reinstall the game to get it to run better, because Act 3 you're in the city, which is way more taxing on your computer. Because you have to render everything above and below you.
Yeah.
So I reinstalled the game from my normal disk drive to my solid state drive just to get it to load faster. And it did help. But I only have 2 of my video games on that solid state drive. I have StarCraft 2, just so that runs as smoothly as possible. And then now Baldur's Gate 3.
Gotcha. Yeah, okay. I'll keep my mouth shut then. I'll wait patiently.
Yep. Can talk about how it all ends and so on with plenty of spoiler tags. But I'm enjoying the journey. There's like so much different stuff that happens along the way that makes every run interesting, even if you've already been there before. Especially if you're bringing different classes and characters to the table. Like they're saying different stuff and you're using different abilities and approaching the fight in different ways.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's a pretty good time. I'm enjoying that. And then I've been playing a lot of Dota 2 as well, which losing a lot of games in that feels kind of bad sometimes, but
it's the MOBA experience.
Yeah, it is for sure. Definitely gives you lots of opportunities to talk about tilting situations. People get very tilted in that game. The thing is with Dota is there's no surrender button, so you're kind of trapped in hell with your bullies. And your bullies can just continually beat the shit out of you right next to the end zone for a long amount of time before they actually close the game. And that causes people to be kind of bitter sometimes.
Yeah.
So that's the thing.
Yeah.
And then we have the Oscars near us, and that's happening alongside pro-Palestine protests. So there was actually some people running at the red carpet and stuff, and a whole bunch of extra police got called in because of that. So they had to like partition off the roads and stuff and make sure people protested in their orderly manner. There were a lot of orderly protesters as well, and this is the thing with so many different protest movements that have happened across time, where the movement could have a valid cause, but there are oftentimes some very wild people who will show up to those who are going to pull some stunts and like do crazy shit. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone was involved in that, but that can occur there. So I didn't see exactly what happened, but there definitely was a massive increase in police presence in the area just to make sure the celebrities got their fabulous time and it wasn't interrupted by world events.
Yeah. I mean, if you feel strongly about it, then I can understand.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how much good it's going to do, but hey, every little bit helps, I guess.
Yeah. One thing that's been interesting is that the Israel-Palestine issue has been very heavily focused on in our social media cycle still, where there are so many other issues that are equally valid or more valid in terms of human cost that we don't talk about as much. So, yeah, something to be aware of. It. I think it's a good way to challenge yourself too. If you feel like, I don't know, people are being too noisy about one thing, it's like, what else is happening in the world? So we do know Israel-Palestine has been happening, but there has been a resting level of violence there for thousands of years, unfortunately. And it will probably continue. Have there been any like major developments or anything?
As far as Palestine?
Yeah. So we had the October 6th thing, and that was the one that a lot of people heard about. And then Israel had some set of responses to it, but did they get the hostages back? Like, what's the status of the...
Oh, hell no. I mean, fundamentally, there's been no change.
Oh, okay.
You know, they did successfully rescue a few hostages, I think a couple weeks ago. Some of them have since died. That is to say, since October, the initial event. And but otherwise, most of them are still in the custody of Hamas.
Gotcha.
So there hasn't been any change there. For the most part, the trajectory of the conflict is just the Israeli army pushing into various areas of Gaza and trying to dismantle Hamas infrastructure of various sorts. You know, we talked a little bit about it a couple of weeks ago, but you know, the general idea is that they want to destroy machinery that can be used to produce things like rockets and other weapons. They want to destroy the tunnel systems that Hamas has used to smuggle in resources to build weapons, as well as to engage in general commerce, through which they taxed, and you know, the proceeds from which funded their various activities. And I guess that's the gist of it thus far. You know, the Israeli government, especially Netanyahu, still talks a big game about destroying Hamas, but now there's been more and more talk about curtailing Hamas's ability to perpetrate violence. So it seems that the government is kind of shifting the goalposts a little to that. But Netanyahu himself still talks about destroying Hamas, of course. But at this point, that seems more of a political talking point than a substantive objective.
Yeah. And like you said, thank you, Crushinator, for the raid. Welcome. The thing with his leadership style is it's a very gung-ho, we're going to be aggressive and bring the fight to them. It's not as much like, hey, let's think about a good faith gesture to try to de-escalate tensions and to try to establish a new peace of some kind. That's not really the angle that he's going at, because you get a lot of support by rallying around your people and saying that you're going to go kick ass to the people who hurt you. Like, we've seen that play out so many times. That's a big part of how 9/11 was such a springboard for our adventurism in the Middle East. Like, we did legit get attacked and people died, and that hurt us and people got pissed off. So whenever the U.S. is going out and doing stuff, people are supportive of that because we feel like we need justice for what happened. And if a attack like that happens, like, how do you get justice? You can't take them to prison or something, or take them to court, because it was the nature of the attack was a suicide bombing kind of a thing. So it felt like we were robbed of people unfairly in a way that was kind of like a sucker punch sort of a thing. So I would guess that a lot of the Israeli people feel a similar way of, with the October 6th attack, they suffered a lot of casualties with people killed or kidnapped, and they've got to be angry about that. So it makes sense that they would want some justice and they would want to have some kind of retribution. So all of that makes sense. And then the flip side of Palestine feeling like they're on the back foot and they're taking casualties is also valid, because they are also dying. So it's a mess.
Yeah, pick a side, cheer from the sidelines. That's pretty much the approach most people outside of the region are taking.
Or it's so messy that it may be unwise to even cheer for a side in particular, and to more encourage collaboration and talks, maybe ways to de-escalate.
That would be the wise approach, but it's not the fun approach.
Why
People
not a
prefer
prisoner
to get
exchange?
excited.
Aren't those good?
There have been negotiations over that.
Yeah.
Hamas wants to exchange hostages for prisoners,
Yeah.
but the Israeli government has balked at the numbers. Generally, exchanges like that between Palestinians and Israelis are very just uneven, shall we say. A very small number of Israeli hostages generally nets for the Palestinians several hundred Palestinian prisoners. So it's not a great exchange rate from the Israeli perspective, especially since a lot of those guys are, radicals of one kind or another. I think I read recently that in a previous such exchange, some years ago, one of the guys that the Palestinians got back was the guy that ended up organizing the October attack.
Mm-hmm.
So there's been some consternation in Israel over that fact, and that's led to relatively more resistance regarding exchanging quite so many Palestinian prisoners for hostages this time.
That one's going to feel really icky giving that guy back.
Yeah.
Takers.
So, yeah, there's some developments. Let's see. There was Rafah. So the Israelis have been mostly focusing on the northern part of Gaza. They've been working on southern Gaza more recently for the past couple months. But they haven't been going as hard since there's not like anywhere for people to go, So they kind of have to be a little more careful than they were in the north. They had let Rafah alone up until now. And the significance of Rafah is that that's the town on the border with Egypt to the south, through which a lot of commerce and aid had gone into the territory. And if there is an Israeli offensive there, then that's going to almost certainly close the border. And that's going to result in even fewer supplies making it into Gaza. And there's already reports of starvation amongst swaths of the population there owing to lack of aid, lack of food, etc., to say nothing of issues stemming from a lack of medical supplies, healthcare, electricity, modern sanitation, those kinds of things. So, the situation is getting dire for the regular people in Gaza. And so that's led to a particularly strong pushback to the Israeli announcement that they were considering an offensive into Rafah. So even the U.S. government has been trying to discourage them from doing that. Whether or not that works, we'll see. Nothing has stopped the Israelis thus far, so I'm a little skeptical, but it could prompt the U.S. government to take relatively more forceful action in order to try to deter them or otherwise exact some kind of cost.
Mm-hmm.
So there's been drama there. There was also an incident involving an aid truck in which a bunch of Palestinians supposedly, again, pick your side and cheer for them, like whoever you want to believe. Just depends on who you trust more. So in this case, the allegation is that the crowd rushed the aid trucks in a way that made the Israeli soldiers there afraid that there was going to be violence. And so they allegedly shot over the crowd, and in the melee, basically, a bunch of people were trampled. The alternative story is that they fired directly into the crowd and killed a bunch of people.
Mm-hmm.
So again, whoever you want to believe, the result is the same: 112 dead and about 760 people injured.
112 dead?
Yeah.
Damn.
So whether they were shot to death or crushed in the crowd, whatever. Again, whichever side you want to believe.
Mm-hmm.
Our bag here isn't telling people what to believe, but that did happen, and so there's been some angst and debate about what exactly actually happened and who's to blame. So they're going to go around and around on that forever, I don't doubt. The U.S. did get involved when it announced in response that it was going to start dropping aid into Palestine by air, and that a couple other states in the region would also participate in that program, including the Kingdom of Jordan. So, the United States government did not come out and say that Israel was responsible for killing all of those people, but it was sufficiently frustrated with the unwillingness of the Israeli government to allow more aid into the country that it took the opportunity here to announce this change in policy, again, the airdrops of aid, which the U.S. had not previously been doing.
We did airdrops of aid where?
We have not been doing it previously.
Oh, but we started to?
Yeah, in Gaza. We just started doing that, I think, a couple weeks ago.
Oh.
Cool. So that's
what stuff do we drop? Just like food?
Yeah, food, maybe some medical supplies. I didn't read the details. I imagine food is going to be the main thing, though.
Nice. Why doesn't Israel want to give them food? Like, wouldn't that make them like them more?
The Israelis would say no, actually. They don't think they would like them more, but it is a fair point. I think the Israeli concern is not so much that there's not enough food or too much food, as the case may be. The Israeli concern is that if they allow lots of aid into the territory, then it will be used by Hamas to raise money. They'll seize supplies, sell it, buy weapons, that kind of thing.
Mm.
So there is concern that these sort of mechanisms of humanitarian assistance will be abused by Hamas.
Mm-hmm.
So they've been very reluctant. They have allowed in some aid, but they've put more restrictions on it, and they've got a pretty stringent vetting process in order to ensure that nothing untoward is being slipped into the country under the guise of humanitarian aid. So combine that with all of the disruption to normal economic activity, and you get a humanitarian crisis. There's just not enough food in the country.
Mm-hmm.
Regardless, airdrops are not going to be enough. You would need to do a lot of airdrops in order to meet the caloric needs of the population of Gaza right now. And the pace of airdrops thus far hasn't been enough to meet even a fraction of the need. So it's more of a symbolic action. It's more a form of implicit pressure by Washington on Israel to signal its displeasure and its growing willingness to take unilateral action.
Huh.
Yeah, there was a macabre story regarding those airdrops recently. Apparently, one of the crates that was airdropped had a faulty parachute that failed as it fell, and it ended up killing 5 people, allegedly. Yeah. Now, that hasn't been confirmed. That was alleged again. There is video of a crate falling without a parachute or with a failed parachute, but it's not clear if that was the crate that killed anybody or if anybody even actually died. So again, this is all allegations, but I did think it was very much in keeping with the situation as far as the Palestinians go. Even when people are helping them, they still suffer. So very much in keeping with the theme of the conflict.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, other stuff going on. There's been talks over a ceasefire and a hostage exchange. There was some excitement over that, I think, a week or two ago, because there was actually agreement on a framework for that agreement, which was a significant step forward. But then I believe I read that the Israelis ended up walking away from the subsequent negotiations because of disagreement over details. So there hasn't been any progress there. It's worth mentioning, too, that there are growing protests within Israel regarding the hostage situation. Basically, the same people that didn't like Netanyahu before the October attack are now coming out and demanding that the Israeli government focus on getting the hostages back. I would point out that the military operation in Gaza is a consensus issue. The vast majority of people support that. But the dissident factions within Israeli politics are now voicing increasing discontent over the fact that the hostages have not been retrieved yet. So there is growing political pressure within Israel on the Netanyahu government. Even if he leaves, the military operation will not end. So that's the key takeaway there. That's not going to change. Whatever government is in power is going to keep doing that.
Well, they're probably going to be like trying to do something until the hostages are back, I would guess.
Yeah. But if Netanyahu is gone, that could somewhat moderate the Israeli government's approach to the conflict, given how hawkish Netanyahu is, especially with regard to some of his coalition partners and their approach to managing the West Bank. Certainly some moderation would be pretty useful there. So we'll see. That's an ongoing story. The most recent thing was technically it was announced in the State of the Union speech by Joe Biden recently, but it had already been leaked in the week before that the United States government was going to build a floating harbor just off the coast of Gaza, and that it would use it to try to get in more aid. Again, between the disruptions at the Rafah crossing and the fact that Israel has closed its ports to aid, there's significantly less aid coming into the country. So the United States is going to take direct action here and try to create floating infrastructure to facilitate the transfer of relatively more aid, certainly more than they could get in via air.
Did Israel shut off their aid because of the October 6th attack?
Yes.
Okay.
There was a shutoff of aid. Palestinian workers are no longer allowed to cross into Israeli territory for work. And when I say Israeli territory here, I'm including settlements in the West Bank, which arguably are occupied territory. Regardless, Israeli factories, either in occupied territory or in Israel proper, are no longer hiring Palestinians. They've basically ejected them and are looking for other sources of foreign labor. I think there were talks with India that might allow a lot of workers from there to migrate over to Israel to work temporarily in factories. Yeah. So they cut that off. I think they also cut off water, if I'm not mistaken, as well as electricity. A lot of the electricity and water in Palestinian territories had been sourced from Israel. So that also was cut off. So the Israeli government just basically did a full separation of any kind of connectivity with the Palestinian territories, specifically with Gaza, after October. And that was just a part of their general campaign of pressure on Hamas.
Yeah, it's kind of like saying, give us our people back or we don't let you have access to anything nice.
Yeah. Well, I don't know that I would say water is nice. It's more of a necessity.
We won't let you have anything.
Yeah.
Damn. Well, that's pretty aggressive, but it doesn't actually get the hostages back. For some reason, I thought it was going to be like a Spec Ops shit where they like got like their best and they do some crazy kung fu shit in the night and get their people back or whatever, but I guess I've watched too many movies.
I mean, they've been trying that, and they did get a couple weeks ago, like I said, like that. But Hamas is like well aware of Israeli capabilities, so they've been using countermeasures to try to negate the possibility of that happening successfully. They don't keep all the hostages in one location. They separate them and keep them in multiple locations. There's not any one place you can go to and get them all. So it's inherently difficult then to figure out, one, where they are. And even if you figure out where they are, that won't necessarily matter because they move them around also. They constantly change their locations, and they generally keep them underground. So they're not generally moving around in sight. There were some reports of some hostages at a Palestinian hospital, allegedly. But, who knows? Again, it depends on who you want to believe.
Yeah. I've heard lots of stuff of people saying that children are being targeted specifically and stuff. There are people who have very strong feelings on both sides. It kind of feels like one of those situations where you want to tell both of the kids to put down their toys and to stop thwacking each other with them and just to be cool for 2 seconds. But yeah, I don't know how to actually make that happen. Like, what is the route to peace here? Because like going in and physically getting the hostages with violence is going to incur some death, most likely. So that's an aggressive move that's going to raise tensions on the Palestinian side rather than lower them. But the Palestinians having the hostages is morally evil and nasty. They're just like fucking innocent raver people. So as a person who likes electronic music, like that's the kind of show that I could have been at if I was an Israeli person. So that's really fucked up. And those are just normal people. And I was talking about how you can't just say all Israelis or all Palestinians as an entire category. You're talking about millions of people, right? So, yeah, I don't know. Just being able to distinguish between, okay, this is an agency that executed an operation that hurt a lot of people, so they should be held accountable, not the entire country of people. But that gets kind of complicated. It's easier to put things into simple categories.
Oh, yeah. But, you know, that just gets into the whole history of the conflict, you know.
Yeah, which we've been over a few times, so we don't need to revisit it every week, but it's a thing and it's been around for a while. And the signs point to it will continue on for some time. But that makes sense that there would be a lot of action from people who are kind of wanting support for Palestine and stuff, given that they're cutting off so much of necessities from that region, and that is also going to put pressure on normal people. To me, that feels kind of mean as a military tactic, because it does directly cause suffering for civilians and not just the military operations. Ideally, like if you're conducting war in the ideal capacity, you just savage all of their military equipment and ability to fight and you hurt no one. That's like the elegant win without death. If you could do that, but that's like technically impossible, just because a big part of their will to fight is just the people themselves and their ability to stash stuff and to have backup plans and so on. So you can't just completely disarm them. But how do you get to a state of peace in the current climate? Make people do group projects together. I don't know. I don't know. Get groups of 6, 3 Israelis, 3 Palestinians, and make them do something productive together. And then they'll realize that they're more similar than they are different. I don't know.
Yeah, the real answer is that you don't. You know, the conflict is going to run its course. The only question is how many people die until it reaches whatever conclusion it's heading towards. Whatever that may look like in the end. Presumably, it'll involve the release of the hostages at some point. The Israeli government does not seem able or willing to agree to a ceasefire unless there is substantive concessions regarding the hostages. And Hamas's credibility on that count is pretty low, so it seems unlikely that's going to happen. So I imagine the Israelis will just keep going. They're going to keep destroying infrastructure until they have curtailed capacity to their satisfaction. But what they do from there is anybody's guess, because I doubt they're going to find the hostages, regardless of how hard they're looking. I don't think they're going to find them.
Just go over there and yell at all of them. You, stop having hostages. It's bad to have hostages. Give them back. You, stop having hostages. It's bad to have hostages. Give them back. Stop shooting each other. Be normal. Get back to work. Boom. Fixed.
Well, I would be careful. I would be careful with the word normal there, because this actually is pretty normal for the Israel-Palestine conflict.
Oh.
Maybe the scale is not. Yeah. The scale might not be normal, but certainly the violence is pretty normal. So, if they actually did all the stuff you said, that would actually be pretty abnormal for them.
Oh. Be different. Be peaceful.
There you go.
It's a new idea. I like to spend my weekends with not killing people. Whenever I think about a great way to spend a sunny day, not killing people is always high up on the list, because killing people is wrong and you should stop doing it today.
That would be ideal.
Yeah. Speaking of killing people, before we started, I saw an article that people ate sea turtle meat and it killed 9 people and made 87 other people food poisoned.
Sounds painful.
Yeah, sea turtles eat jellyfish, and jellyfish are very zippy, zappy, and toxic. But the sea turtle doesn't care, but the humans who eat the sea turtle get the revenge of the sea turtle and the jellyfish.
Yeah, seafood can mess you up if you're not careful.
Mm-hmm.
Even if what you're eating hasn't been eating a highly toxic animal like a jellyfish, they can ingest a lot of the pollutants in the water.
Yep.
The Gulf of Mexico is particularly dirty. So you kind of have to be careful here in Texas with seafood during certain times of year, especially if you want to eat something raw like an oyster or something.
Yep, I've been vegan for about 1.5 years now, so that's one of the interesting choices you can make for diet. And then other people make various diet ethical choices of maybe they don't eat this or that based on how animals are, but for the sea turtle case, that's just straight up poisonous reptile. You just ate a poisonous reptile, you will now take damage. Some people took lethal damage. That's crazy. I didn't realize they were that poisonous. We also do shit to the oceans too, which degrades the quality of seafood.
Yeah.
Like dumping garbage into the ocean is such an easy thing to get away with, I feel like. As long as your equipment isn't documented, but even if it is, like, who's going to go out there and fish you and fine you for throwing your stuff in the ocean? Nobody, really.
Yeah. Well, hopefully they can clean that up sooner or later.
Yep.
There has been some progress with that huge-ass garbage patch out in the Pacific, so
yeah,
maybe there's hope yet.
I've heard they said that the cost of fixing it isn't even that much, like, relative to a lot of other global problems. Like, it's maybe a couple billion, which is, it's still a lot of money. No normal person can just afford to fix that, but when you're looking at the size of governments and stuff, if you had a couple countries collaborate together, or even a couple bored billionaires who wanted to be famous, like, that's a really easy way to be famous of the person who cleaned up the oceans. That would be a good legacy to have, to be honest.
Yeah, pretty handy. We'll probably just fill it up again with crap, but certainly any effort to mitigate it will be helpful.
Yeah, we'll fill it up with new and exciting crap. Better than the old crap.
Yeah. Lots of plastic out there, unfortunately.
Did we have any good or funny news? We've been hitting like dreary stuff.
You know by now that I don't do much funny news.
You do plenty of funny news. What are you talking about? Dude, Locust versus Duck was one of the best segments we ever did. That was a key highlight of world discussion.
True. Point conceded. Well, I don't think I have any stories like that right now.
It's okay.
The 2020s are not particularly humorous, unfortunately.
And nothing really substantive with the U.S. elections. I know primaries were happening, but I would guess it's kind of same. It's going to be Trump and Biden again.
Yep. They both pretty much cleared the field on Super Tuesday. So no surprises there. I think Nikki Haley did win Vermont, if I'm not mistaken. And I think she also won earlier the District of Columbia.
Washington, D.C.
Yeah. I didn't even know they had primaries. I guess I shouldn't be surprised. They do have electoral votes, but I have never heard any reporting on District of Columbia's primary before. So Nikki Haley winning it is the first time I'd even ever heard of it.
Oh, chat, thank you. You're super correct. Real quick, there was a funny thing that happened. Mongolia responded to the Putin interview about the historical boundaries of Russia. And they said, hey, you want to see our historical boundaries? Sheesh, Mongolia pretty big.
Yeah, that was pretty good.
I'm glad they have a sense of humor about it. Not really a
Oh, yeah.
superpower current year militarily, but if we have a nuclear fallout or whatever, and we have to go back to the old ways of bow and horse, if it goes back to bow and horse tech, they're going to be good. They really owned all of Asia and Europe with that.
Oh, yeah. They're going to be raring to go when World War IV rolls around.
Sorry, you were saying something about someone Haley won?
Oh, Nikki Haley. Yeah, she was Trump's main opponent in the primaries. Pretty much the only one left standing.
Huh.
So she'd kind of been hanging on, even though there was virtually no way she was going to win.
Mm-hmm.
So after Super Tuesday, it became statistically impossible for her to win.
Mm-hmm.
So there was some thought maybe she would stick around for the convention and kind of contest it, but she did end up dropping out of the race. So it is Trump's nomination now, effectively.
Okay. And then, is there any chance anyone else challenges Biden or no? Because I think Democratic Party is not really about that.
Yeah, I don't remember if anybody's still running. I mean, I think RFK is, but I don't think he's running as a Democrat anymore.
Mm.
I think he went independent. So no, there is no substantive opposition within the Democratic Party as far as the presidential nomination. So Joe Biden pretty much has it locked down now.
Okay, well, primary's over then, Rip.
Yeah, I think there's a couple left, but they don't really mean anything.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, I think there was a couple other things happening in U.S. politics more broadly that were of note. Basically, all of it just has to do with the Trump wing of the Republican Party gaining more power relative to the more traditional wing. Did you see that Senator McConnell is going to step down as Senate Minority Leader?
Oh, I didn't see that.
Yeah.
Why?
He announced that. He was kind of cagey about the exact reasons why.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, he said he's getting old. That's what it comes down to. Kind of, I think the exact thing he said was that one of the most useful skills in life is to know when it's time to move on to the next chapter.
Mm-hmm.
Something to that effect.
Super, like, normal Hallmark card wisdom.
Yeah. So, basically, he's getting older. He's not in touch with the Trump wing of the party, which is gaining in power. So he's moving out of the way. He did say that he's not going to resign from the Senate. So he is going to serve out his term as senator, but he's just not going to be Senate Minority Leader anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So there's been some jockeying for that position now, and it's not clear who his successor will be. Most likely it'll be somebody who's much more pro-Trump.
Mm-hmm.
I think I remember seeing there was some talk about John Cornyn potentially getting the role. He's a senator from Texas, where I live. I found it pretty interesting. Ted Cruz is definitely the more high profile of Texas's two senators in Washington, but John Cornyn seems to have the inside track on the job. Let's see. And the other thing that happened had to do with the Republican National Committee. For those of you not really familiar, both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have their own, basically, central committees that are very, very weak compared to their equivalents in Europe. But in the United States, their role is pretty much restricted to things like funding, fundraising to get money for campaigns, and then the distribution of that funding to strategic campaigns in specific parts of the country. So generally during a presidential election year, the Republican National Committee and the Democratic equivalent will sort of align with the campaign staffs of their respective leading nominees. And so what's happened recently is that Donald Trump endorsed his daughter-in-law to serve as a deputy on the Republican National Committee. And I think that did end up happening since I took these notes. So that's not unusual, um, as far as like campaigns coordinating with a party committee like this. It's a little unusual to have your daughter-in-law do it.
Is that nepotism? What is that?
Yeah, pretty much. But more to the point, it sort of reflects the Trumpian preference for family,
Gotcha.
specifically loyalists. And you're not going to get loyalists more loyal than family generally. So, Trump is has been known to do this. When he was president, a lot of important positions in his important positions in the executive branch were either filled officially by family members or people with very close ties, or those people had very important unofficial roles within the executive branch. So, for example, his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, took the lead on helping with the Abraham Accords and the negotiation thereof in the Middle East. He did not have any official position within the executive branch. He did not have an office or otherwise some kind of official capacity, but he was given an unofficial position that came with security clearance and various other perks. And he was given the nod to help lead those negotiations over and above official staff in the State Department who might normally fulfill that role. So Trump prefers loyal people, especially his family, if possible. So this is very much in keeping with that style of government. And the fact that he was able to successfully do that is not necessarily an indication that he's seizing control of the party and making it literally his party. But it is a step in that direction. His popularity only ever grows with time. And the more powerful he gets, the more he and his personalized approach to politics has come to perforate and permeate Republican Party institutions, much to the chagrin of the traditional establishment party Republicans, who don't really appreciate having to share space with him. They still don't really get along. So whether or not he's able to push those people out and completely subordinate the party to his own personal interests is sort of an open question. That would be very interesting in terms of political culture in the United States. It's not actually new in the United States. Historically speaking, political parties, generally at the local state level, less so at the national level, but it used to be relatively more normal for these sorts of machine-style politics to predominate, where you have basically one charismatic leader, then apportioning seats out via patronage network, as a patronage network, and generally populating both official offices of state and informal offices in political parties with loyalists. So we had gotten away from that as the middle class sort of emerged as a dominant force starting after World War II, roughly in the 1950s. We still have machine, parties and politics in the United States, but in general, they've been subordinated for generations now to ideological politics, generally the ideological politics of the middle class. So the fact that Trump is kind of bringing back the older style of politics is genuinely surprising, because you would not necessarily expect that in a country with a large middle class like the United States. But to a degree, if you look at the constituency, that is to say, Trump's core supporters, they generally tend to be more working class. And historically speaking, it's the working class in the United States that has been both the biggest beneficiaries and the biggest proponents of machine politics. Historically speaking, it was working class immigrants who were the main recipients of benefits from large establishment machine political parties and movements. For example, Tammany Hall in New York City being a famous example. So, you could see this as a return to form then, in that sense. One of the things that's happened over the past couple decades is a sorting, maybe a resorting or realignment of political forces in the United States. Before, there had been more of a divide in the working class. Generally the pro-union working class voted more Democrat, and generally more rural working class folks like farmers and other equivalents had voted more for the Republican Party. And in general, that meant, given that there were obviously a lot more urban working class people, that the Democrats had the lion's share of that vote. But over the past couple decades, that shifted so that almost the entire working class now is voting for the Republican Party. So correspondingly, working class politics, preferring historically more patronage style politics, has potentially transformed the Republican Party into a previous iteration of itself, something that would not have been out of place in the late 19th century, early 20th century.
Rollback. We're doing an old build.
Yeah, the Democratic Party, in turn, has very much become the middle class party, with all of the, with all of the advantages and disadvantages of that. Whether or not that shift in the Republican Party is permanent is an open question. It's not necessarily inevitable that it just permanently changes. It could be that Trump himself is driving that change, and that when he leaves, the older middle class iteration of the Republican Party will return. But it's not clear if that, again, it's not clear if that will happen. We just don't know. The future of the Republican Party could be Trumpian national conservatism, or that could just be a flash in the pan, historically speaking, akin to the populist movement in the late 19th century, which gained a lot of force, but never firmly entrenched itself as an independent political force. Its ideas ended up getting co-opted by one or the other political party. So it could be that's what happens with Trump. It could be that the most popular elements of Donald Trump's campaign platform are co-opted by either the traditional establishment Republican Party or the Democratic Party, if not both. And that could serve to diffuse this shift towards old school patronage politics. But on the other hand, maybe it's permanent. Maybe we are just going backwards. That would come with potentially severe repercussions as far as the health of political culture in the United States. I mean, if you study democracy and the philosophy relevant to it, one of the big warnings that has been issued for centuries has been the threat of the demagogue. Those people will tear apart democratic institutions and subordinate them to their own interests.
The demagogue, what's that?
Demagogues are basically people who just play to the crowd, tell them what they want to hear, and manipulate them into thinking that they have all of the answers.
That makes sense. Charlatans, snake oil salesmen, people who play to the bias of the crowd as well to make them feel smart, empowered, and on the right side.
Yeah, unfortunately, democracy for thousands of years has had history of being destroyed by demagoguery of one form or another. So I would have thought the United States, being the current standing oldest democracy and certainly the most powerful, would have been more privy to the dangers of demagoguery and would more readily identify it when it emerged, but that has not happened. So liberal democracy is a fragile thing. Whether or not it makes it through this particular iteration of demagoguery is unclear. Earlier iterations were eventually defeated just through co-option. Again, what's popular is adapted as policy by traditional political parties and elite actors. So that has been the trend. You have seen both parties, for example, becoming more hawkish on free trade and China in particular. So, that was a status quo in American politics for such a long time. That is to say, free trade was the status quo for a long time, and it seemed unshakable, and now it's been shaken pretty firmly. Also, immigration has been something both parties have shifted to the right on. You saw Joe Biden going down to the border and talking about, shutting it down and all this kind of thing. The compromise bill that was being negotiated involved unprecedented powers to just stop people coming across the border and seeking amnesty. So, that's a big change from the Democratic Party's previous position. So you can definitely see that the populist movement in the United States right now has shifted the center of American politics on several issues. That's not a problem per se. That it's good that people's desires and demands are being represented in the national politics. That's not a problem. That's the system working as designed. The problem comes when ambitious individual actors try to hijack that process to gain power for themselves and not to represent the public and the public interest. That's the biggest concern and gripe from establishment liberals of both left and right variety regarding Donald Trump. If Donald Trump were a more conventional politician and sort of observed more of the norms of liberal democracy, trying to govern as a unifying candidate, not constantly agitating his opponents and dissidents, and not talking quite so cavalierly about getting revenge, quote unquote, on enemies, to say nothing of undermining institutional independence by trying to stack them with loyalists and family members. If he didn't do that stuff, then all of the other stuff he's been doing as far as becoming more changing policy to be more hawkish on free trade in China and what have you, these sorts of changes would be much more acceptable to the establishment, and there would be much less angst in American politics. But this is why we can't have nice things. The United States cannot have a major political shift like this without drama. That's pretty much been the case with every similar incident in American history. So we'll see if we make it through this case. Time will tell. But certainly it's not lacking for excitement.
Survive, America.
Yeah.
Well, we'll see. Is there any prediction about who's going to win between Trump or Biden, since they're
still too early to tell? It's going to come down to, what is it, like 10 to 20,000 votes? Because we already know how a whole bunch of states are going to vote, right? California is going to go Democrat, Texas is going to go Republican. So we have a pretty good idea of what the electoral map is going to look like. So it kind of comes down to the battleground states. But even within the battleground states, most of the districts are going to vote one way or the other for sure. And so you have battleground districts within battleground states that are sort of the swing districts that both parties are focusing on. So the population of those swing districts comes out to just like a couple thousand people. It's measured in the thousands. It's not very many. So those are the people who are going to decide one of the most impactful elections in recent memory. It's probably the most impactful election in living memory.
Why?
Given how stark the choices are. Joe Biden is very much a establishment, normal, status quo politician. Very bland, very much a measure of continuity with what had come before, with some moderate changes here and there. Donald Trump, in contrast, is a radical candidate that wants to radically depart from previous norms. Whether those norms involve making himself de facto God Emperor is a point of contention. Certainly, he's going to change much more mundane things on a number of policy counts. So, a radical candidate versus a status quo candidate, that's going to have pretty significant repercussions as far as things like foreign policy, not only with regard to trade, but even things like Ukraine and whatnot. NATO, America's national security apparatus has particular concerns about what Trump might do. But, if he wins again, there's not going to be nearly as much they can do to stop him as there was during his first term. I was telling a friend from China recently that if Trump does win again, he's going to have much more loyalists in his government from the start. And so all of the sort of weird, crazy stuff that he wanted to do but couldn't do in his first term will probably actually happen this time. So it'll probably, his administration will probably be even...
all the crazy stuff. That's too much.
Well, sure, he's not going to nuke a hurricane, fine. But, some of the other things that people did not do because they were explicitly illegal probably will happen. There's not going to be nearly as much pushback this time.
Makes sense.
So it'll probably be even more dramatic the second go around than it was the first time.
Well, that's going to make some people upset, but that's how it is. We'll see what happens. Make sure to register to vote, chat. Love you guys. Use your best judgment. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for. I'm not your dad. I'm not your mum. I'm just a streamer. We're going to buy Greenland. Who wants to live there?
Well, the people already living there, certainly.
It's not very many people.
What is it, like 60,000?
I think it's smaller than most cities. I don't know exactly how many. What is the population of Greenland?
56,653
Okay.
as of 2021.
So less than Louisville, Texas.
Yeah, it's not much. Denmark's not interested in selling, though.
Yeah.
Not least because the government of Greenland itself isn't interested.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's been trending towards independence. I'm sure they would prefer that option over and above being an American territory.
Mm-hmm.
That would give them a lot more leverage.
Yeah, we haven't really seen Greenland in the news too much aside from that, so I guess that did give them some PR.
And that wasn't even the first time we tried to buy it. The U.S. government tried to buy it after World War II. Wanted to use it as basically a big air base. There was concerns about Soviet bombers coming over the Arctic and whatnot. And Denmark wasn't any more interested in selling back then. They did allow the construction of American bases, so Washington ended up getting what it wanted anyway, but was not able to annex the territory formally, as I'm sure they would have preferred. Yeah, there might be some good stuff there that we might find once all the ice melts. It's been melting at an increasing pace, so there might be a lot more mineral extraction in Greenland in the upcoming decades.
What minerals would be there?
Who knows? Nobody's really been able to explore it much on account of all the ice.
Huh. Don't we need that ice for, the sea level to be at the correct spot?
Well, people can move.
The pragmatic. Yeah, you can move out of the way. It's fine. That's true.
Well, if we're not on pace to significantly reduce emissions, then, all of the basically it's going to happen unless we can make dramatic changes, and it doesn't seem like we're going to. So most likely there will be a sea level rise, if predictions about sea level rise are accurate. Some people quibble about that. There's a debate there, but regardless, if climate change is going to cause sea levels to rise, unless we change, I would conclude, given that we're not going to change, that they're definitely then going to rise. So it's going to happen in that case, if we want to make that assumption. And that being the case, yeah, people are going to move. I don't imagine they're going to stay in a waterlogged city. That's not really practical.
Maybe we'll regret not buying Greenland when we had the chance.
We've got Alaska.
Yeah, that's true.
Alaska's huge. Got lots of space up there.
Canada is going to be stonks, man. They have to wear sweaters and stuff all the time. But not anymore.
Yeah, it could work out for them. I guess you could build seawalls. That might help in some cases. But I think a lot of cities are just it's going to be too expensive for a lot of places. Some cities are just too low for that to even really be feasible. Places like Miami and New Orleans, for example, are pretty much screwed.
Already a swamp.
Yeah.
I think Fuzzyport's been taking some questions from chat. I didn't really get the chance to see too much news aside from people talking shit and making accusations without substantive evidence, so not too much to report from those, but people did say words about each other, and some of them were very mean.
Yeah, prototypical internet banter sounds like.
Yep. Also, clickbaity headlines.
Well, naturally. Comes with the territory.
Got to get that engagement.
Let's see, we had a question about RFK. Do you think the RFK vote is more anti-vaxxer Republican who doesn't like Trump or Democrat that doesn't like vaccines? I don't know that vaccines are really all that relevant. RFK is kind of the fringe outsider candidate, and that always appeals to a certain proportion of the voting public. But I guess the question you're getting at is, who does he benefit more by running for president, Trump or Biden? Depending on whose voters he pulls away in sufficient number to potentially affect the outcome. I don't know. I haven't seen polling on that. I don't know that he has enough voters to necessarily make that much of a difference. I don't even know that he's on every state's ballot yet. So I would have to punt on the question. I don't know. I think a more interesting question would regard, what was it? It was like a third party thing. They were trying to run like a unity candidate that would appeal to both Republicans and Democrats. No labels, that's what it was. Yeah, there's a group calling itself No Labels, which is trying to run a candidate for president that will supposedly toe the line between left and right in a way that will sort of take advantage of concern over Trump's populism while also offering an alternative to a very unpopular Joe Biden. And that's been kind of a shit show. They haven't been able to organize it very well. There's been a lot of resistance from both the Republican and Democratic parties. Probably more so the Democratic Party, since I think No Labels is thought to have the potential to pull more votes from Biden than from Trump in the general election. So they've been having a lot of trouble getting onto ballots because they keep getting sued. Democrats in particular have been watching them like hawks and making sure every I is dotted and every T is crossed and all of the relevant paperwork. Yeah, as if that isn't bad enough, they themselves have kind of really struggled as an organization to campaign, to get their message out, and to even find viable candidates. I don't think they've even decided on a candidate yet. Nobody's even like trying to get it. They're basically trying to beg people to be their presidential nominee, and it hasn't been working. So if there is a third party that swings the election one way or the other, it seems more likely to be No Labels at this point than RFK.
You said it's called No Labels?
Yeah, No Labels.
Haven't heard of this. Mission is to support centrism and bipartisanship through what it calls the common sense majority. It was founded in 2010 by current President and CEO Nancy Jacobson. Huh. Interesting. Haven't heard of this before. What sounds very diplomatic. Its purpose is to organize American voters against partisanship in politics and encourage a common ground approach to problem solving.
Yeah, it makes sense. They just haven't been able to implement it very well. Yeah, again, the concern is that that's going to pull voters from Biden because we have a first past the post system, right? So, votes going to third parties are basically just thrown into the ether. So both parties want to maximize the amount of votes going to them. And that's especially important in an election that's going to be as close as this. So any strong third party is basically sabotaging one or the other party, depending on whose voters they're pulling more of. Yeah, it's actually how Bill Clinton probably got elected in the first election that he ran in for president. Ross Perot was running in that election. And I remember reading that it was thought that he pulled more Republicans than Democrats as far as people voting for him. And the result is that George H.W. Bush ended up losing an election that he would have otherwise won. So that's the Democrat fear as far as no labels. You know, if they could have run a better organization and built more confidence that they could actually field a competitive candidate and a competitive campaign, it wouldn't be as big of an issue. But as is, they've been too slow. They haven't been good at fundraising, like any of the important technical stuff you need to do to run a successful candidate. Certainly as a third party, they have not been doing. So at this point, they're going to serve more as a spoiler than they are as a viable alternative.
Yeah, we haven't really had a legit third party contest the Democrats or the Republicans ever. And whenever someone does run in that kind of side lane, it usually subtracts from the front runner on that side of the political spectrum. So I was thinking of Hillary and Bernie Sanders, that competition within the Democratic Party even causing for there to be weakness that allowed Trump to win. It's a very interesting meta because it forces you to very seldom vote for the candidate who you like the most and almost always vote for the lesser of two evils. That's what voting feels like most of the time. Would you say, this is a poll for the chat, would you say that voting feels like the lesser of two evils, or do you feel excited about voting for your person?
I'm assuming you're asking more the Americans in chat.
Yeah. Well, there are people in other lovely democratic nations.
Yeah, even in a multi-party system, like in the representative voting systems in Europe, they tend to have the problem that while you can vote for the party of your choice, they generally end up having to build coalitions that subordinate a lot of the smaller niche parties that are more popular in a way that basically defangs them. The concessions they get in order to get their support are generally pretty mild. There's been a lot of discontent in various European countries with small third parties on that count. Yeah, in the UK, they had the Lib Dems. I think it was like 10 years ago or so. The Conservatives didn't have an absolute majority. They needed a coalition partner, and so they entered a coalition with the Liberal Democrats. And if you're not familiar with the Liberal Democrats in the UK, that's like a libertarian type party. So Lib Dems were able to get in. They wanted a bunch of stuff. The Conservatives said, we'll give you like one thing. And, being in a coalition means you kind of have to boost the coalition in order to maintain popular support. You can't really shit talk your partner too much. But the fact that the Lib Dems got so little in that coalition agreement meant that they were effectively defending a government in which they were getting very little. And the result is that they lost voters. Like, their voters kind of turned on them. They just didn't see them as being a viable alternative. If the best they could do was like the one minor concession the Conservatives gave them, then it was not seen as worth it. And so a lot of voters either stopped voting or started voting for the Tories or started voting for other third-party candidates or parties. So, these other alternative systems are not necessarily better at producing actual change that the people who most want those kinds of systems in the United States might like.
Yep, every system has some flaws to it as well. It's hard to make it perfect, but we're trying to have the most fair possible given the circumstances. But it really depends on who you ask for what is the optimal state of fairness. Discussing democracy, good or bad? We got a poll in the chat going. Is voting the lesser of two evils, or are you excited about who you vote for? I think it depends on the election year for sure. Some people were happy to vote for Obama. He definitely won a lot of hearts and minds. But a lot of evil people can do that. What's the word? Demagogues. Yeah. Fun word of the day.
Yeah. It's an older school version of populist, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you want to talk a little bit about Kinmen?
Sure. What's
That's
Kinmen?
that's the little island just off the coast of China that Taiwan owns. We've talked about it before. It's the one that's right next to that big city, Xiamen.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, in general, relations between Taiwan and the PRC are pretty normal overall.
Mm-hmm.
There has been some escalation over the past couple of years, but it's been pretty incremental, and it's mostly just been nuisance type stuff rather than substantive violence.
Mm-hmm.
But in the case of Kinmen, they've seen examples of this escalation come in the form of things like cutting internet cables,
Mm-hmm.
which happens with like great regularity. It happens more than you think. It's actually not abnormal for internet cables to get accidentally cut. Sometimes ship captains can be very lazy about where they lay anchor,
Mm-hmm.
and so that can create problems. But it happens often enough in the case of Kinmen that there is some suspicion that it's happening on purpose. There's not really anything Taiwan can do about it. Again, the island is right next to the mainland, so options are a little limited. But that is one of the types of things that the Chinese government might be doing to antagonize Taiwan and just maintain that sort of a moderate level of tension, so to speak, just to keep the pressure on. Yeah, there was also maritime rules. Being so close to the mainland means that there can often be issues as far as things like fishing rights and borders and whatnot. So supposedly there were two mainland Chinese fishermen who were in Taiwanese waters around Kinmen. And so the Taiwan Coast Guard went after them, and in the course of chasing them, one of their boats actually capsized.
Oh.
And a couple of the fishermen on board ended up drowning.
Damn.
So that's an issue, right? Because whenever Chinese nationals, that is to say, mainland Chinese nationals, end up dying in an incident like that, that always brings the Taiwan issue kind of back to the fore.
Mm-hmm.
And the party has to respond, right? It can't just sort of ignore it, because then the nationalists on the mainland will pitch a fit.
Mm-hmm.
So Beijing came out and they kind of huffed and puffed a little bit. They said that the issue had damaged the feelings of compatriots on the mainland. One of those kinds of statements. So they weren't happy about it, but they also were clearly not willing to escalate it. So, I think there was like a somewhat higher level and incidence of patrols around Kinmen as far as the mainland Chinese Coast Guard. But beyond that, nothing further came from it. But little issues like this are not that uncommon, and they're an example of how Kinmen Island in particular is a kind of flashpoint. It's easier to be a mainland fisherman and to get into Kinmen's waters than it is into, say, mainland Taiwan's waters, which is much further away.
Mm-hmm.
So, if there is a Taiwan Strait crisis, it's possible that China could initiate it just by staging like a full-scale invasion. That's always possible, but a more likely instigator is going to be something to do with Kinmen. That it could very easily be a flashpoint.
Interesting. Oh, there was another thing that's come up multiple times over the past few days. Haiti. What's happening in Haiti?
Oh, it's melting down.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, like it's always been bad in Haiti, right? It's not that shocking, that they're having problems. But even by Haiti's low standards, the past couple years have been catastrophically bad.
Yikes. Just violence, lawlessness.
Yeah. So you remember when the president was assassinated?
Hmm.
Yeah. So ever since then, it's basically just been open free fall. Because the guy that replaced the previous president, whom I believe was his vice president, has not been accepted as like the legitimate president of the country. Like most people think that the current sitting president and previous vice president was actually in on the assassination of the previous president. And there's been more evidence to that effect that has emerged since then. So the public rejects him. And also, because the state has lost even more legitimacy, I guess, so to speak, local elites in Haiti have been using gangs to compete with each other more openly for power. And the result is that there's been endemic gang violence at a far higher level than had been the case before. It used to be that, gangs were active, but generally you could avoid them and go about your day. You could kind of live your life, go to work, etc. There was always a baseline level of risk there, but it was tolerable. But since this open competition for control at the local and national level has happened, gangs have been outwardly violent towards people living in the territory of competing gangs. And so the result is basically a kind of medieval raiding culture has emerged, wherein gangs will launch raids into rival territory and then they'll either kill, torture, rape, or kidnap civilians living in those territories. Generally, a combination thereof. It's not just one or the other.
Jeez.
And so the result is that has become just commonplace to the point where people cannot even go to work anymore. Like the Red Cross had to suspend operations in the country because its volunteers literally just could not get to the workplace because it was so dangerous.
Damn.
So, the incidence of things like STDs stemming from rape have skyrocketed. Deaths have skyrocketed, specifically violent deaths. Kidnappings have become so endemic, it's basically become like a leading industry. The huge amounts of money change hands in order to ransom people who have been kidnapped. So it's pretty bad. It's pretty terrible, really. And there's been some talk about how to fix it, and the United States government's opinion of the matter has been that it's terrible, but it's not our problem. Washington does not want to get involved in some kind of overseas peacekeeping operation, given that foreign adventurism is very highly suspect amongst the voting public. The fact that it's an election year right now just makes it even worse. So Washington does not give a shit about this right now. Right now, this is somebody else's problem. So there has been very little action from the United States. And the reason that's notable is that historically the United States has generally taken the lead on trying to stabilize Haiti whenever it starts spinning out of control. There's been a number of interventions into Haiti over the years. I think the last major one was in the 1990s, but I also think there was a big humanitarian operation about 15 some years ago when there was a big earthquake. But this time, the United States is MIA. They're not really taking the lead on that. So as a result, Haiti is spinning out of control more than usual because the usual correction mechanism in the form of foreign intervention is not really on the table. The result is that the Haitian government, specifically the president, has been trying to get support for an international mission, specifically an international peacekeeping mission that can help restore order. And there's been fairly little enthusiasm for that. There's been some success. Kenya has expressed interest. But when the Kenyan government announced that they were going to make a deployment of troops, a lawsuit was filed by a dissident lawmaker, and the Supreme Court actually blocked the deployment. So there's been negotiations about that. Those are ongoing. It could still happen, but it's not really clear. And it's worth pointing out, too, that polling suggests that the broader voting public in Kenya is not that enthusiastic about a deployment. So not really a lot of political support for it and some institutional opposition. could block it from happening. We'll see. The Bahamas, Jamaica, and the state of Antigua and Barbuda have also expressed a willingness to contribute troops, but generally the deployments being offered there are pretty small. The Bahamas is only offering 150 personnel, which, that's a lot for them. It's not a big country, but it's not going to be enough given the scale of Haiti's problems. So, the Kenyan proposal was 1,000 police officers, which is a much more substantive contribution. But it's not clear even if that would be enough. I think more recently, another African state called Benin offered to send 2,000 troops. So not just police officers, but actual infantry. That could certainly be helpful if it actually happens. But again, the whole international mission is still being negotiated. It's not clear if and when it'll happen. And it's not clear even if the current president who is negotiating this will remain president for long enough to see it through. He actually traveled to Kenya after Kenya's Supreme Court sort of blocked the operation. And he wanted to try to, negotiate directly with the Kenyan government to kind of salvage the operation. And while he was gone, the gangs united. They created a kind of united front in order to prevent him from returning to the country. And so they've been going particularly ham in the past couple months on that count, so that they can create conditions on the ground that basically make it impossible for the state to govern, so that they can kind of de facto seize control. It's worth mentioning here that the leader of that coalition is the leader of one of the most powerful gangs in Haiti, and he's a guy who calls himself Barbecue. So he has the potential to become the new leader of Haiti if his coalition actually does overthrow the government, in which case there may actually be a President Barbecue.
It does, like you're saying medieval, it does feel like these are the feudal lords who are now contesting who will be the shogun.
Yeah.
Who is going to be the shogun? We are all just gangs that just do gang pirate shit. But ultimately, the government has the monopoly on violence, so the biggest gang becomes the government.
Yeah. Yeah, they actually attacked the main airport in the capital, Port-au-Prince, because they knew that the president was on a plane back to the country, and they didn't seize the airport, but because the airport was under attack, the flight ended up being diverted to Puerto Rico. And right now, the president of Haiti is still trying to find alternative ways to get back into the country, because there are still no flights into the country available. If nothing else, he can sneak across the border with the Dominican Republic. That's sort of the last-ditch effort there, the last possible option. But that's a pretty ignominious way for a president to come back to his own country. So I don't know if he'll be willing to do that. We'll see. Yeah, let's see. I've got some notes here. The upsurge in violence also includes raids on 2 prisons, the result of which is that thousands of prisoners ended up being released. Let's say they set the peace court in Croix des Baguettes on fire. They looted or torched more than 20 other buildings. At least 6 police officers have been killed. And the National Police Academy has been destroyed, apparently.
Oh, ouch.
So that's where we're at. The gangs have united together into a kind of super gang and are challenging the government for control of the country.
Pretty wild. Doesn't seem like the best time for a visit.
No, it is not. Yeah, if you want some adventure travel, maybe then. But even in that case, it would be extremely dangerous. Yeah, there's actually been a lot of gang violence in Ecuador recently. Have you heard about that?
No.
Yeah, so this goes back to this has kind of been an ongoing thing. This has been a rising trend in Ecuador for the past 10 years or so. Basically it had to do with a shift in drug routes. Before they had been kind of circumventing Ecuador. Maybe not circumventing. Ecuador just wasn't really a major part of any established drug networks. But eventually drug network shifted to include the port city of Guayaquil, which is the main commercial city of Ecuador. I think it's the largest city, technically. And so over the past 10 years, there's been a corresponding rise in gang-related violence as various, generally Mexican-linked drug cartels set up operations in the country and effectively subcontract out, violence and drug running to the local gangs of one kind or another. So as violence has escalated, there's been increasing incidents of extreme gang violence in places like prisons. I think a couple years ago, we even talked about how there was like a spat of major prison violence in Ecuador that had seen something like dozens, if not hundreds, of prisoners killed between incidents. Mm. So it was pretty clear that there was a problem. But then last year, as part of the presidential election, things really kind of hit a critical point when one of the leading, maybe not one of the leading, but one of the presidential candidates running, and more important to note, a presidential candidate running on a platform of anti-crime, cracking down on gang violence in particular, was assassinated. He was killed outright. And it wasn't any mystery who did it, right? The gangs were kind of open that this was done as a message, don't mess with us. Mm-hmm. So that, of course, had a pretty deep impact on the campaign, and dealing with the crime issue and the gang issue became of paramount importance. So the guy who ended up winning the election, who was not of the same party as the guy who was assassinated, but the guy who won the election committed himself to significant reforms in order to try to deal with gang violence. And among these measures, including investment in a maximum security prison, a very large one, to which all of the leading gang members, and especially senior gang leaders, would be relocated in order to curb their activity. He also talked about a significant increase in the budget for security forces, in particular the police, and various other little measures here and there to try to deal with the problem. So the result then was that in the early months of this year, there was a big escalation in violence instigated by the gangs. It was, the beginning of this period was marked by the disappearance of gang leaders from the major prisons. It was no secret that the gangs basically controlled the prisons anyway, to the point where the gang leaders being there was, more a point of legality and trying to technically observe their sentence, more so than it was substantive incarceration and correction, like we would think of it here in the United States. They were technically in prison, but basically it was their own gang-owned resort, effectively. But when the government committed to cracking down and relocating the leadership to an actual maximum security prison, the gang leaders responded by fleeing the prisons. They also started fighting each other. That's kind of par for the course at this point. But their disappearance then was followed by a massive campaign of violence targeting security forces. Several dozen, I believe, police were killed. Correspondingly, there was also a number of government facilities that were attacked and set on fire. So let's see, 7 police officers kidnapped, several explosions, prison violence, etc. Oh, also a particular incident of note that, some people on Reddit may remember. Gang members, specifically gunmen, as they were described, with explosives, no less, stormed a TV station while it was still on air. So if you were watching the news at midday when this happened, you would have actually seen the gunmen, start corralling the the news anchor and whatnot, as well as various personnel working there, being sort of gathered up and rounded up. The police ended up diffusing the situation, and by diffusing it, I mean they raided it and arrested all of the perpetrators who were there. But still, the fact that it was done at all, was quite significant. It was a very brazen move on the part of the gangs to do that. So lots of drama in the first couple months of 2024.
Yeah.
And the government responded by declaring a 60-day state of emergency, and they also designated the gangs as terrorist organizations, so that, legally speaking, the Ecuadorian military could be sicked on them. which is another thing that they've been doing. So yeah, it's pretty bleak. It's been a very rough, violent period for Ecuador. I haven't heard much news out of Ecuador since the violence kind of escalated, so I don't know if it's still happening or how successful the Ecuadorian government has been in dealing with it. But certainly, this is a major inflection point as far as how the issue is dealt with. Before the issue had kind of been tacitly ignored. Nobody really wanted to deal too much with it, but now they kind of have to. So we'll see if the Ecuadorian government actually follows through with its big anti-crime pledge, or if they end up kind of reverting to status quo, where they just kind of try to push it to the background.
We'll see. That's a issue that we don't really hear too much about in our news cycle. Latin America doesn't really get that much coverage, I feel like, for main U.S. news anyway. Also, welcome everyone from chat. I realize lots of people are international. The two people who are talking, myself and Agent Smith, are both from the U.S., so if you want to share your perspective from a different country, welcome that. We're not here to tell you how to think. We're just trying to figure out what's going on. Welcome.
Yeah, I'll throw out the usual disclaimer so I don't forget and then have to do it at the very end, like I did last time. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. No, I specialize more in economics and foreign policy. So, if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, let me know. I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will come back and read it later. So, I will see all the feedback eventually. Yeah, unfortunately, drug trafficking has been big business for a long time in Latin America. And a lot of the smaller states just don't have the resources to deal with it. It's actually been much easier, especially in Central America, for political elites to align with some of the major cartels. Not necessarily formal alliances per se, but they kind of have de facto agreements where so long as the political elites are paid off, they won't crack down too hard. Yeah, the former president of Honduras, actually, I think a year or two ago, was not only he was convicted. Actually, he was convicted and is in prison now for his complicity in drug trafficking in Honduras. So it reaches the height. The very highest parts of government in the region. It's a pretty endemic problem. But unless you want to go full El Salvador, there's not a lot you can do about it. Again, there's just not enough resources to contain it, and the political culture also is not helpful. The political culture in Latin America tends to be pretty opportunistic and malleable on questions of ethics like this.
What does it mean to go full El Salvador?
Oh, you've never heard of the world's coolest dictator?
How cool is he?
That depends on how you want to define cool. He actually calls himself that.
Oh.
It's not even like a media thing. Like he calls himself the world's coolest dictator. It's kind of hilarious. Yeah, his name is Bukele.
He really took that Yas Queen, if you got it, own it thing to being a dictator.
Yeah.
Look, if you're a dictator, I know some people are going to hate on you and say that's not a very good ethical form of government, but you live your life. It's funny.
Yeah. He goes hard.
Yeah.
He leaned into it. Yeah, really the genesis of Bukele's presidency is a little more complicated than maybe people think. Like generally the story you see in media is that he got popular because he wanted to crack down on crime, and then actually successfully did it. El Salvador had one of the highest murder rates in the world just a couple years ago, but since Bukele's really doubled down on anti-crime efforts, it's actually got a lower crime rate than Canada, I think. Something to that effect. So the change has been dramatic. And people in El Salvador are very happy about it. Like they're quite happy to talk about just how much substantive actual improvement there has been. and how pleased with Bukele they are on account of it. That's the short version of the story. The longer version is more nuanced. So Bukele, originally he ran on an anti-crime platform, sure, but he also ran on other things. He was originally more of a center-left politician who was running on things like, a stronger social safety net, more government spending, that kind of thing. But he was also kind of a populist. He took elements that were popular from both left and right and kind of fused them into a single campaign platform. And he was pretty successful at that. But his main approach to dealing with crime in the first, let's say, 2 years or so of his administration had more to do with cutting deals with the leadership of the gangs. And, we can't necessarily prove that, but, from what I've read, that is sort of the general consensus. There's a lot of evidence that there was a kind of quid pro quo between the government and the gangs, that the government would not mess too much with them so long as they mitigated violence. This did not really significantly reduce the burden on the local population, the actual citizenry, stemming from the gangs. They were still sort of raping, pillaging, and murdering with great alacrity, as well as extorting from businesses and whatnot, the usual repertoire of violent gangs. But the overall headline numbers of violence were falling. But eventually what happened is that they spiked again, and that had to do with a perception that the El Salvadoran government was not holding up their end of the deal. So the gangs retaliated and tried to pressure the government into giving more concessions. And the result then was that the Bukele government broke completely with the gangs and engineered a strategy of cracking down on crime that was basically twofold. One, they gave police emergency powers to arrest anybody who they even suspected of being a gang member. And two, they built a giant maximum security prison in which they've basically just thrown all of these gang members, suspected or actual, and thrown away the key. They're just going to keep them there forever, basically. And, some innocent people have been kind of implicated as a result, but the overall impact has been very effective. Keep in mind that being a gang member in El Salvador almost always involved having gang tattoos, so it was not that hard to identify them. So when I say arresting suspected gang members, what that really translates as is anybody with gang tattoos was arrested and sent to prison.
Jeez.
So yeah, that's pretty harsh. And again, a lot of innocent people were, arrested correspondingly. There has been some effort to try to deal with them, but the results have been so successful that people are willing to look past that. They're also willing to look past the fact that their civil liberties have effectively been suspended because, again, there's not really much due process going on. Again, the police, if they think that you're a gang member, gang tattoos, again, being the main indicator, but, there may be other things, they'll just take you in, and the courts will, they'll sentence you, they'll convict you, basically based only on the word of the police. And conditions in the maximum security prison that were built are not great. Basically they've got them in there packed all together in these big cells. It's not like here where you have here when I mean the United States when I say here in the United States, it's generally like 2 prisoners per cell, roughly. In this maximum security prison, they'll have 30 to 40 per cell. They're relatively larger cells, mind you, but the capacity is supposed to be more like 20 to 30. Mm-hmm. So they are actually still over capacity. And they don't really have beds per se. What they have is these metal bunk beds with no mattresses. And everybody just has to share them. And also, for each cell, which again holds 30 to 40 people, there's only 2 commodes that they have to share between them. And there's no room for them. It's just out in the open. So again, pretty rough conditions if you do end up in this place. Mm-hmm. But everybody hates them. That is to say, hates the gangs, so nobody really cares either. They do not make for sympathetic victims here. So Bukele, because of this major crackdown and because it was so successful, is enormously popular to the point where he won re-election as president recently. They just had another election, and he is going to be president. He is going to get a second term as president in El Salvador, correspondingly. Which is interesting because the El Salvadoran Constitution actually forbids any president from having more than one term. He ignored that, and now he's president again.
Oh.
Such is his popularity that nobody was able or willing to really challenge it, despite the fact that his running for a second term was explicitly unconstitutional. I would point out, too, that when he was trying to get the legislature to pass his anti-crime reforms, there were a lot of opponents, people who were skeptical, and he responded to that by sending the army to the legislature to threaten them into voting for said measures. So he's not kidding when he says he's a dictator. Like, he pretty much effectively is. He's not necessarily the most ruthless of dictators that Central America has ever seen. He's still relatively mild. And there is still something resembling freedom of speech in El Salvador. More and more of the media is kind of owned by people who support him, or is otherwise co-opted. But it's not like full dictatorship, right? It's not like a totalitarian state, at least not yet.
Mm-hmm.
And he has done other little things. He tried to make Bitcoin official legal tender in El Salvador.
Oh, I remember this guy.
Yeah, same guy. So, that didn't really work, but, it was an example of the kind of experimental type stuff that he likes to do. Mm-hmm. So, he's not just a dictator in it for the power. He does try to do things. The crime crackdown was like one such experiment that happened to work really well.
He's not just a dictator. He's a dictator who cares.
Well, you can think of him as being a populist dictator, right? He appeals to the people. Previous dictators in the region have generally predicated their rule on things like national security. Containing communism, for example, was a popular one for a long time. Or they're just ruthlessly violent, as was the case with somebody like, say, Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. But this guy, Bukele, predicates his authority more on just popular appeal. And he's been pretty successful at that. So he hasn't had to be particularly ruthless in order to maintain power. Mm-hmm. That'll probably change. Sooner or later, his popularity will wane for one reason or the other. And when it does, then you could see some fireworks. But for now, the country is very much in its honeymoon period with Mr. Bukele. So he's very popular. So it seems that he is indeed the world's coolest dictator right now. I would point out, too, that he's actually very young. He's actually, late 30s. So he's not that much older than we are.
Huh.
Yeah, have you ever heard of CPAC?
I don't think
That's a big conference that the Republican Party holds every year. And generally, it's the more radical fringes of the party that have been showing up for the past 10 years or so. It's kind of evolved or maybe devolved, depending on your perspective, into like an expression of radical conservative views. And guess who was invited to speak there this year?
He was?
Bukele. He showed up. He came. And he gave a speech talking about how it was possible to deal with crime if you're willing to go hard enough, and that conservative Americans can take their country back if they're willing to keep fighting for their country. Which, given the authoritarian circumstances in El Salvador, is not a very comforting thought. Mm-hmm. So, I was not entirely happy to see that. But, that the fact that his crime program was so successful has been potentially an example for other countries in the region who are dealing with similar problems. And they may deal with it in a similar way. Ecuador's government kind of is doing something similar by building a maximum security prison and declaring a state of emergency. So you may see similar measures there. But of course, the concern and criticism is that, if every country does this, then we're going to end up with the entire region run by populist dictators, which is obviously going to have severe long-term implications for human rights and political stability in the region. So we'll see who wins out. The forces of populism are very much on the march in Latin America.
We'll see indeed. We live in a very silly and interesting timeline.
Yeah.
We've been wrong about stuff before in terms of making predictions, so who really knows?
Would you like a fun trivia number?
Yes.
So as of mid-2023, the number of forcibly displaced people worldwide was estimated at 110 million.
Mm-hmm.
Very high.
In what year you said?
2023.
Okay. What's is there a historical number we can compare that to?
It's the highest it's ever been.
Oh, okay. So in absolute numbers, people are very displaced right now. That sucks.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not going great right now on planet Earth. We've got some problems that are escalating. It doesn't seem like anybody knows how to stop them. Because it's not like World War II, where you've got like very clear-cut malign actors who are actively trying to wreck shit. In this case, a lot of it is just sort of economic, political, and social malaise. Many of it long-running that is reaching just critical levels and resulting in not always even just conventional conflict, a lot of the time unconventional conflict, civil wars, banditry, etc., that is just wreaking havoc across broad swaths of the world. I think we've talked about the Sahel before and how that's basically just imploding. That's an excellent case in point here. General violence in the Middle East is also kind of complicit, but general violence in the Middle East is not really a headline-worthy event. That's just sort of the normal course of events there. Yeah, so that doesn't surprise anybody. But it has escalated over the past 10 years, the Syrian civil war being probably the main driver. Lots of people from Syria have ended up displaced on account of it. But even if you look at Latin America, the collapse of Venezuela's economy resulted in a lot of people leaving as migrants. And in the past couple of years, Cuba and Nicaragua have seen a lot of people leaving, possibly with state support, supposedly, depending on who you want to believe. And you can see how many people are crossing the U.S. border with Mexico right now. So, it's not even just Africa and Latin America anymore. People from Asia now are even coming across the southern border because conditions there have been getting rough, economically speaking. So yeah, it's a mass migration of people, some of the largest ever. And this is just from general bullshit happening. It's not like a big war. It's not a major cataclysm. It's just a general decline in economic and political conditions. That is enough to create a disaster of this scale. Damn. You can imagine how much worse it would be if there actually was like a substantive catalyst driving it. Yeah, that would really put the heat on.
Well, here's to hope we get our shit together fairly soon.
Good luck with that.
Thanks, we could use it.
We doing okay on time?
Well, we started late, so I'm down to go for maybe another 15 minutes or so.
Oh, okay. That'll work.
Yeah, I'm still kind of in mourning from my Baldur's Gate run. Fucking level 6, Act 2. 25 hours. What have we learned? There were so many like close calls in that run through that made it very fun. It's just like, damn, I can't get that back now. It's gone. That's a big part of the intensity of the honor mode run, though. Is you know that it's like do or die.
Who is your main go-to guys in your party?
I had Karlak as a wolf barbarian.
All right.
I had Lae'zel was a paladin. I think it was a
that's pretty cool.
Oath of Vengeance paladin. So kind of aggressive. And then Shadowheart was a life domain cleric. And then my player character, who looked kind of like a haughty tiefling babe, was monk rogue. I gotta give context,
Of course. Yeah, if you're gonna have a bard, hot babe is the way to go.
Yeah. So monk rogue is really cool if you go thief, because then you get 2 bonus actions. So that means twice as much kung fu shit every turn.
There you go.
Very fun. Yeah. So yeah, I made a bard to start this time, but I'm not sure what I'll stick with. We'll see. See how long it lasts. Yeah. That was the farthest I've gotten so far, so I'm not really salty about it. Like, at least I didn't make a previous silly mistake. I think those are more tilting. I died in a new way, which is always good. A new and refreshing way to die.
I think we did get a couple more questions. Let's see. Can you talk to the difference between drug cartels and gangs in, I guess, South America and Central America countries versus U.S. states? Rule of law is much stronger in the U.S., so drug cartels cannot operate nearly as openly. They are here. I don't doubt that there's no small amount of, what do you call it? Money laundering. That's what it's called. There's no doubt no small amount of money laundering going on with the cartels in the United States. It's not hard for even like ruthless dictators in other countries to, embezzle money from their publics and then invest it in the United States, basically as a safe haven. So, cartels are going to do that too, right? If dictators can do it, the drug cartels can. But, in Latin America, police are much more easily bribed. Politicians it's much easier to access politicians and either intimidate or bribe them. Probably both generally is the case. Here in the United States, you don't see that so much. I'm sure it's happened. I've heard about border guards, for example, being bribed. But I've not heard of any major scandals involving cartel bribery of actual politicians. If they're bribing politicians, it's probably like really low-level politicians, like local government elected people, maybe like a sheriff on the border or something like that. Yeah, given the extent of U.S. intelligence operations and the overall U.S. security apparatus, the cartels are pretty wary of antagonizing the U.S. government overall. You kind of saw that when those African-American folks ended up getting killed on the border. Accidentally, they were mistaken for like rival Haitian gangsters. And so the cartels immediately like produced the people responsible and offered them up for arrest and all but apologized for the mistake, as it had the mishap. So that's sort of the difference, right? It's a difference of the strength of the states involved. The state in El Salvador is not the best example at this point, but the strength of the state in Honduras, for example, or Bolivia, is way weaker than that of the state in the United States. And so correspondingly, there's a lot more room to maneuver for cartels in terms of throwing money around in order to influence politics. So I think that's sort of the main difference there. And I would point out, too, that we basically have, like, the same gangs. It's not like there's separate U.S. gangs and separate Latin American gangs. Like, the biggest gang in El Salvador was MS-13, and that originated in the United States, right? That was founded by El Salvadoran refugees fleeing the Civil War in the 80s who came to Los Angeles and then formed gangs and then were expelled because of said gang activity and then started up their gang activity again once they were back in El Salvador. So, these networks are all interconnected. Even if you are an independent gang in the United States, for example, like odds are you have some kind of business or connections to cartels across the border. So, in terms of business activity, if that's what they're asking about, like it's all just one entity. It's all basically one large drug trafficking institution. So in that sense, they're not really different at all.
What do you do? We trade drugs. Fair enough.
And so the next question was related. What influence do you think cartels and gangs have in American politics? Not much. In so much as they have influence, it's how they're used as a bludgeon by people who want to be, quote unquote, tough on crime. People talk about the threat that cartels pose and how they could infiltrate the United States and how they're crossing the border and committing crimes and all this kind of thing. As though there aren't already plenty of gangs here who do that anyway. It's not that big. It's kind of a difference at the margin at that point.
Mm.
But as far as like direct influence, like what they wield in Latin America, as far as I know, there's no equivalent in the United States to that. If I'm mistaken, let me know, but that is my understanding. It's not really worth the effort to them, from their perspective, to get involved in American politics when there's a very good chance they'll get caught. And also, given that if they are caught, there's likely to be some severe retaliation in order to discourage it from happening again. It's easier just to sell the Americans the drugs they want than it is to get involved with their politics. Lots of Americans want drugs and are willing to pay lots of money for them. Why antagonize your consumer? Easier to just give them what they want and leave. Most of the reason that drug cartels engage in influence peddling in the politics of Latin American countries is more to do with securing drug routes, right? They don't want states getting involved in the trafficking of their narcotics into the United States. So mostly they're just bribing politicians and police to leave them alone more than anything. They're not really that interested in the ins and outs of policy debates about how large the state should be, or how much social security there should be, stuff like that. They kind of leave to the politicians and the voting public. They don't really care too much about that. Again, it's mostly about their business and protecting their business. Mm-hmm. So, given that the United States is the end consumer, they don't really have to worry about that as much with us. Again, we're the buyer. So, your buyer is not going to mess with you. The United States government does have extensive operations trying to support anti-drug trafficking operations in allied countries. But as the U.S. government itself has pointed out, a lot of those operations are hobbled because those operations are themselves infiltrated by the cartels. It's no accident that a lot of guys that the U.S. trains to fight drug cartels end up working with them once they retire. That's not at all unusual. That's quite normal, in fact. And there's also the fact that the United States is pretty reluctant to share critical intelligence with allied states for the same reason. A lot of that intelligence, when it's shared, ends up in the hands of the cartels in very short order. So they generally know what's going to happen before either the United States or allied states are able to pull it off. They can generally prepare for it so that nothing substantive is gained. So overall, not much. That's my argument. There's not much impact on American politics beyond the indirect impact of the crime debate here, if not also the southern border debate.
Yeah, it's an interesting discussion of just drugs in general and their place in society and which of them we want to schedule and regulate versus which ones we want to legalize and regulate, because we get tax revenue from stuff if it's generated here. So like different states opening up a weed industry, which is basically used to be taken care of by crime. Used to have to be involved in crime to be able to sell weed in a lot of states. And even still on a federal level, it's not legal. So it's still kind of in a gray area where technically you're not supposed to do it, but the federal government is not widespread enforcing that. And that is one of it's like an energy niche that you refuse to capitalize on, that if you as the government and as the legal society don't capitalize on it, then other people will do so when it comes to stuff that people get addicted to, like drugs. So should you schedule it? Should you treat it as a medical issue? How can you find safe places to use some drugs when some of them you can't overdose on? So it makes sense that you would want to protect your population and make some of these things illegal, but it does empower a lot of these gangs. If they're willing to deal in these substances, then they get to corner that market because no one else is going to touch it.
Yeah.
It seems like mobs and gangs and stuff is definitely up at the moment. We've had multiple different descents into lawlessness and feudal lords.
Well, that's part and parcel of that general deterioration in global security. Generally when we talk about that, we're talking about the war in Ukraine or deterioration in the Sahel with all of the banditry and violence there. But that also manifests as criminal activity.
Mm-hmm.
And as we can see in Latin America, that can be quite violent.
Mm-hmm.
So, certainly Latin America is not as bad as the Sahel right now, fortunately. But, the deterioration in terms of security and the ascendancy of the power of gangs, the ascendancy of gangs in terms of their power, rather, that is of concern. And that is, that's just part of the general trend downward here.
Mm-hmm.
And, hopefully we can reverse it eventually. But for now, we're kind of on the roller coaster. We're in the exciting bit of the ride.
Yeah. But improvement is a squiggly line anyway. You're not going to have an upswing every day.
Yeah, certainly.
I have hope for a brighter future and for more hostage exchanges and faith in institutions and so forth.
Yeah, here's hoping.
It's going to be spicy this year because people are going to argue about Trump versus Biden. Which of them is the worst person? Oh, I wouldn't want this person to be my ruler.
Who are you going to vote for emperor?
For emperor.
Yeah, the imperial presidency.
Make sure you guys register to vote for emperor this year. Fortunately, we do have more checks and balances on our executive than other countries, which is a little bit why sometimes talking about the candidates can turn into hyperventilating, where if they had the same level of power as, say, a Vladimir Putin or someone who had a complete stranglehold on power, they would be able to change a lot of stuff very fast. But because you have to jump through many hoops to actually get stuff through, a president can't just will their vision into existence like a king can or a queen can. They have to argue with the legislative branch, and they have to deal with the judicial branch going at them if they're naughty, kind of a thing. So we'll see what happens, but I think the people overall are going to be fine. The thing that this group, what is it, No Labels, common sense majority, I do agree with that sentiment, that I do think the world has a common sense majority of people who are just trying to pay bills and be okay. And they're trying to vote for people who are going to help them be okay and live a good life and so on. And we have these demagogues who are saying all the happy, juicy, squishy words that make us desperately need to vote for them. And it's really hard to untangle a charismatic voice from an actual good leader a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely entertaining news, at the least.
Have you ever heard of the Lincoln Project?
Yes, that's the establishment Republicans trying to bring it back.
Yeah. It's pretty funny.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they're going to be that impactful, but they do shitpost a lot on the internet. And some of it can be pretty funny.
Imagine that's like your legit job title. You work for the Lincoln Project and your title is shitposter. Look, the Republicans have their memes, the Democrats have their memes. We need our memes too. You're our shitposter. We expect tweets. We expect Reddit posts that are current and active. We expect Pepe the Frogs. And they're like, okay.
You're joking, but that's actually pretty much what they do. That is basically modern PR in a nutshell.
Hang on, they have a Twitter. Let's go. Abraham Lincoln quote at the top: "You cannot escape the responsibility of tomorrow by evading it today." Ooh. Oh, yeah. Wow. An hour ago with a hot riff. Imagine 4 more years of this shallow, fragile, ego lunatic energy. Okay, so this is more aggressive. Yeah, definitely shitposting here. Definitely shitposting. These opinions are valid. Basically, you can have opinions that are valid, and then you have the spice level of how you deliver them.
Mm-hmm.
This is a spicy channel. That's funny. Well, cool. So, today we talked a lot about gangs, a lot about people fighting and stuff. Also, I challenge people to try to think about eating in an ethically conscious way, and even if you do eat meat, don't eat sea turtles because they will fuck you up. Okay? Stay safe.
Seriously.
Yeah. And we hope for good crops in the coming season so the locusts don't run at them. But if we do, we still have the ducks on dial. And we will send in the ducks once again. Appreciate you coming on as always. Fuzzy Cord, thank you for handling questions today. A little bit of a later start. Thank you for being patient with me. We did a Mindset 101 discussion where I'm trying to talk about different aspects of cultivating a good mindset. And this one today was on mental health. And I did a hecking MS Paint drawing. I'll send you the file for this and maybe even show it on screen for a second. But I just imagined my mental space for a 24-hour day, or just for a general human, and what they would tend to gravitate toward thinking about. And that's going to include everything from romantic partner to video games to intimacy to social media to relationships to drama, politics, pets, music, and even booba. So people have to manage all the different stuff that they're into and figure out what is a healthy balance for me and what I'm about so that I can be a well-balanced person. Because if you're getting stuck on any of these for too long, it ends up being a drag usually. Like it is possible to have too much of a good thing. So it's kind of challenging people to think about in their own life, what do they tend to gravitate toward? What do they tend to get stuck on? And what are they trying to be better at? I'm trying to be better at planning, for sure. Physical activity, I'm trying to lift more. I haven't really had access to a gym before, so that's been exciting for me. I do try to keep abreast of politics, and you help us with that quite a bit, because I think a lot of people end up with the outrage version of the current story, which can make it really hard to know how to think about a situation when they put it into an us versus them, and they put you on the spot of, if you're not yelling with us on the street about this issue, then you're in the wrong. And it can be pretty nasty like that. Video games I can definitely tend to play too much of, and not enough like, hey, you should clean yourself and your home and be an adult. Video games can take up a lot. Booba is definitely a big distraction on the internet. Sleep is something that people can kind of think about and see if they're doing good on and whatnot. But yeah, I would say my big emphasis for this year is trying to up my planning score, have more notes for myself ahead of time. That's one thing that I think Kukio definitely had a better mind than me about, is like really understanding how stuff works. He was like the very technical tinker mind, where anything that was broken, he would just really want to know how it worked and understand it and be able to fix it. And like trying to help my girlfriend set up her new camera and stuff with new tech that I hadn't messed with before. It was like, yeah, let's channel Michael and someone who knew more about this stuff and was also excited to do it, instead of, oh my gosh, I have to figure out how to use this new camera that's so stressful, I'm really pissed, versus the like curious mind, which is, oh shit, this is the new tech, damn, how did they build this? Well, this is cool, oh, it can do this. Like that was more how he would think about a new tech in front of him that he didn't understand. So you can always think about these different elements of your life and then ways to go about them in a healthy way, because our mental health is kind of like a total score that involves everything, between our thoughts to our physical behaviors to just our like physical needs. But that was a fun talk, and something that I'm trying to bring more conversation about, of how to cultivate a good positive mindset where you don't kind of fall into this vortex of cynicism and bitterness. Because I do definitely see a lot of people who, they see these world issues and it's really hard to not fall into cynicism and to remain some semblance of like, hey, well, we're actually making good progress on other fronts, so we don't need to fall into despair. Managing that knife edge of mental health is really tough through a lot of the storms of life. So wishing people courage on that front. And remember that having an authentic, actual conversation with another person is really good and pretty much always better than social media posting. So try not to be too tied with a lot of the new fancy tech ways of talking to people. And if you can get some actual quality time, that's a really, really big plus. Yeah, gratitude is another main theme. Actually, I should just write this on here. Why is this not on here? Gratitude is a big one. Whenever you're being grateful for stuff, that's filling up your thinking space that could have been spent catastrophizing. If you're grateful for, wow, I have a roof over my head, I'm in a country that's not at active war, I don't feel like I'm at a physical risk of violence, that's a big point of gratitude that we take for granted every day. So, yeah, be grateful and try your best.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with catastrophizing. That's one of my favorite hobbies.
Yep.
I don't know if there's a genetic predisposition for that, but if there is, my family definitely has it.
Oh, they think that the worst is about to happen?
No, it's not even that. It's more just an emotional predisposition towards catastrophizing. Like, I've seen that a lot. Saw that a lot with my mother when I was growing up.
Mm-hmm.
And I myself have struggled with that sometimes.
Yeah. I have noticed that sometimes that can be a consequence of dealing with survival situations over time means that you're more worried and on edge about bad stuff threatening you in that way in the future. So I'm not sure if there was a point in your mother's life or whatever where she was not feeling okay or stable, which means that she's like hyper aware of safety and survival needs, which makes it harder to mentally relax.
I guess it's possible. She was just one of those dramatic type people.
Mm-hmm.
So I always just kind of attributed it to that.
Yeah, it could
Very
be.
temperamental,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of thing.
Very true. Well, cool. Thanks for coming on. Chat, thank you for weighing in on the conversation. If we got anything incorrect during this segment, please leave us a scathing review in the YouTube comments. God bless the algorithm. Thank you all for watching and liking. We hold these conversations on Sundays at around 6 p.m. Pacific time. Agent Smith, thank you so much for coming on. I give you your weekly challenge of your 15-minute walk, your push-ups, and your squats if you can do them.
Very well. Challenge accepted.
Very good. Thank you for your time and your energy, and we will see you on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yep. Thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG.